Hey, so I'm going to be talking about genetic disorders. And so basically, of genetic disorders, there's three types. There's chromosomal, and these are going to be things like Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, and Klinefelter syndrome. And then there's multifactorial or complex um, genetic disorders, and these are going to be things like vitiligo, Alzheimer's, diabetes, and then there's also monogenic, and this is going to be something like sickle cell disease, or like cystic fibrosis. And so, of these, like three categories, they all kind of occur differently, of course. And so, of chromosomal, you have basically the way that works. And in the case of things like, for example, Down syndrome, that's when you have three three copies. So this is like each a copy, and that. So three copies, and this is all of your 21st chromosome. Um, and so for chromosomal disorders, basically what happens is that during meiosis, and that is basically when so you have like an egg, and in creation of that egg, you have to take down all the copies of your like DNA, because as people we have all of these copies. And so you have that, and then during meiosis it splits apart, and it becomes that and that, and then becomes that and that. So each of your copies are split apart, and they're duplicated and then split apart again. And pretend like I put all the detail there. And so what happens, instead of your normal process of things splitting apart, instead of it going like your typical like that and ending up going like that and ending up like that, each of them having one pair, it goes into having multiple, like one of them will get a couple of copies. So, and then one of them will get like one. So instead of going normally and having two and two, instead of this happening, this is what happens, is that it splits into one with three sets, and then one with one set. And then when that happens and it splits again, it ends up having like one with from this, that, and that, and then it ends up having one with none, one with one, and then having one with one, and one with two. And this is a problem because each of these should have had one. So this one, this pair should have actually gone to here, but instead it didn't. So now we have two. Well, this will never be viable. But if it happens that this egg or sperm uh, combines with something else during conception, this could cause things like Down syndrome, because you have one you have, like, for example, the egg. Let's say this has the double copy, and then when it combines during conception with the sperm, and let's say the sperm, well, this had only one copy, well, then you go and then you have a set of three. And that's not good because normally you only have one, and then it becomes a set of two. And that's great. But because of that third chromosome, we get our chromosomal disorders. And so this is what Down syndrome is. And so this is generally your more serious genetic disorders, because like you're getting a whole new copy of a chromosome, and that's not good. And so a lot of these mutations aren't viable, and there's very few actual like genetic disorders that result from chromosomal or abnormalities that are going to be viable. And so like trisomy 18 is going to be that you have three copies of your 18th chromosome. And then trisomy 13 is going to be the same thing because it's tri meaning 3. And then you're going to have trisomy 21, which is Down syndrome. And then there's things like Klinefelter syndrome. And these are special because normally men have an XY chromosome, and then women have XX. And so they have a copy of one X and then a copy of another X. Well, in things like Klinefelter syndrome, it's generally going to be men, though this will happen that sometimes a woman genetically has Klinefelter syndrome, but then is born with like feminine anatomy. But men with Klinefelter syndrome, that's KFS, let's call it, it will have, instead of just one, they'll have another X chromosome and then a Y chromosome. And so this will happen, and that will present with a lot of abnormalities. There can be a lot of like feminization of the body. And then similar to this, because it also has to do with your sex chromosomes, women with Turner syndrome will have they won't be having two X chromosomes. So instead of this other X chromosome, they only have one, and that's kind of a problem, and that can result in like intellectual disabilities. It can result in short stature, infertility, and all of these problems. And so that's really not good. But what's really interesting is that what can happen with some chromosomal abnormalities in people is that they can actually be mosaic. And so normally, like in our body, we'll have like an average like 46 like sets of chromosomes. So you have like all of your sex chromosomes. So it's usually like two sex chromosomes, and then like one chromosome, two chromosomes, and so on. And so generally, we all have 46 pairs. Well, in like chromosomal mosaicism, you will find that some cells, not most, not always most, but some cells will have your average of number of chromosomes, and they won't be affected. But then like other cells, like let's say this one, well, instead of having 46 chromosomes, it'll actually have something like 45 or 47. And so things like Turner syndrome, when you only have one X chromosome, can actually be mosaic. So some of these cells, some of them will have an XX chromosome, and this will have an XX, but then some of them will only have one X chromosome. And that can either present generally with less severity. So someone with mosaicism might not be as affected, or they might be like still affected, but they might have like not as much deficits in like intellectual disability or things like short stature, so they might not present like the typical case, or they might not even be affected, like they might not even appear to be affected by these genetic abnormalities. because they're mosaic and because some cells are just normal. And so that's pretty cool. And then aside from those, we also have complex genetic disorders. And these could also be called multifactorial. So multifactorial. And so this can basically have to be like things like diabetes and Alzheimer's. Well, yes, they all have genetic causes, but they aren't just like segregated to one chromosome or one gene on a chromosome. So you can have like all of these chromosomes, this one, that one, this one, and all of these could be like 1, 2, 3, etc. And with the multifactorial uh, genetic abnormality, it'll be like this part of this chromosome has an abnormality, but then also this part of that chromosome has an abnormality, and then all of these kind of combine to have these disorders. But it's not necessarily like, oh, only this trait, only this one here, ignoring that one, ignoring all of these, only that trait is what causes it. And the ones where it's like only one trait is what causes it are called monogenic disorders. And this is because they are caused on one single gene. You see, mono means one, and so monogenic is one gene. And so this can be things like I mentioned with sickle cell disease, sickle cell fibrosis. And so because it's only on like one gene, it's so much easier to test for. And that's always great if you're genetically testing for something, because it's like, okay, you have this one altercation, then you can pinpoint it. And so they can know, okay, this thing is the cause. And this is really interesting. And so like when you learn your general Punnett squares, so you have A, B, and then A, B chromosomes. Well, let's say both of these are dominant, and then both of the B's are dominant, and then this one's recessive and this one's dominant. Well, basically the way it will combine is that you will have A, 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 B, 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 and then B, A. And so this is your little Punnett square, or that's what I believe it's called. But this is great to represent monogenic genetic disorders, because it all has to do with like one gene. And that's what this is meant to portray. And so you have things like sickle cell disease, and it's going to be, you have both of the pairs of the, like, it's like if you had AA, and this would be that you have both of the pairs that of this genetic mutation that causes sickle cell disease. And when you have sickle cell trait, it could be like AB, and so this one is the one that causes sickle cell disease, but you only have one pair of it. And so because you only have one pair, it either means that you're not affected, or you're not affected as severely as this other person who has both pairs. And so this is great because you can track everything so much easier. So that's helpful. And then of things like monogenic and multifactorial genetic disorders, they can be caused either they're genetically inherited via your parents. And so this is typical, like sickle cell disease. Okay, well, then you just like inherit it. But then it could also be caused by mutations after birth. And so things like radiation, chemicals, and um, and other environmental causes, along with your body not correctly getting rid of genetic mutations in your cells. So if a cell goes and they start dividing and multiplying and like going outward, and so these cells become that because they're multiplying. Well, if let's say this cell is affected, it goes and generally, instead of multiplying, it gets killed off, and then this trait doesn't reproduce. But with some genetic diseases, is it can still produce, and then suddenly you get all these cells that are affected, and that's a problem. And so that's something that can happen with things like monogenic and multifactorial genetic disorders. And then things like chromosomal genetic disorders, these are caused by disjunction mutations. And so, like what I showed you at the beginning, where you have all this and then it splits weird and it goes like that. Well, this is non-disjunction. It's not correctly splitting. And that's what generally causes your chromosomal genetic disorders, because they don't separate when you're creating your gametes. And then, yeah, that's kind of it. I'm hoping to talk more about these monogenic and multifactorial diseases later on. But I think that's it for this video.